Well, as you know, China is covered with mountains. There are thousands of mountain peaks all across China. So how in the world do you, in this environment, decide that a mountain peak is special? Why is it special? Why do you single out this one peak out of all of them? What leads to the construction of a sacred mountain? That is, it is in one sense man-made. We project onto that environment many of our ideas, and we, particularly for the Buddhists, they had to make those mountains sacred. And that process by which they make a mountain sacred is part of what I'd like to discuss with you. China has some of the most beautiful mountains in the world. There is no question about it. And some of the most mysterious mountains in the world. Some of the most unusual. But because there are so many of those, even that is not an answer to how they decide and filter out and come to rest on those mountains which they are going to call sacred. For Buddhist mountains, some people have tried to count the Buddhist mountains that have been identified and have been given names and said this is special to Buddhism. The old count always was 219. There were over 200 such mountains that had been identified. Recently, Professor Bingenheimer went through the Chinese local histories, and he's identified 240. The answer is nobody knows. We're not sure of the list of Buddhist mountains. It depends on the source we look at, what we do with that source. But are we sure that we know every mountain that local people have looked at and decided this peak has something to do with Buddhism? I think the list is fluid. It will continue to expand. It will continue to develop. One of the things about mountains that certainly attract people is the physical aspects of them. As I just said, China has some beautiful mountains, unusual mountains, like this one. I mean, it's absolutely almost as if you can say, are you sure that's real? Isn't that a painting? Isn't that somebody's imagination? So the thing which we see, of course, is that the Chinese did make a decision about mountains. Are you an educated person? Are you a sophisticated person? Have you developed yourself? And one of the answers is, have you really gone to the mountains? Have you seen them? Have you traveled? Have you done pilgrimage? These were considered to be very important for human development. And so the artists who painted them were, in a sense, recognizing that for the Chinese, mountains were culturally extremely important. And so the mountain paintings that you see, the Chinese beautiful paintings that have been made, some of them are fairly realistic. If you've ever seen Chinese mountains and just only seen the paintings, you might say, this couldn't possibly be a good depiction of a Chinese mountain. But in fact, as we just saw, it certainly can be. So it's a little bit like we have with the idea, you have to travel to be a sophisticated person. You've got to have gone to other countries, or we still have this idea that travel is what gives you a kind of sophisticated and cultural view of the world. And without travel, you don't really have it yet. The Chinese felt this about their mountains, that one should go to the mountains because those mountains could teach you a lot. And therefore, they became the teachers of China. That's why the emperors would say, I go to the mountains in order to listen to them. Listening to mountains is something which is very strange to a lot of people. What does a mountain have to say? What does a mountain have to teach you? You can look at a place like Wutai Shan. Say, what makes it special? In one sense, you can go there and say, well, this is like 100 other places with peaks and rocks, and it's so. But those who began to go there said, this place is special because Wutai Shan sends out, exhales. It's like the mountain is breathing. It exhales qi. So if the mountain is exhaling the energy of the earth or of the cosmos, you want to be there to get the qi. It comes to you by being in contact with it. So mountains not only affect you mentally and spiritually, but physically. So that's why mountains became so very important to the Chinese. And you could not have a Buddhist practice in China without including the mountains. If you excluded the mountains from Buddhist practice, it, in a sense, I believe, would have failed in China. It is through the mountains, in many ways, that the practice of a lot of people was done by their pilgrimage to the mountains. And that, therefore, when we look at this, in order to understand Chinese Buddhism, you've got to see the mountains. You really, I think, have to. From the point of view of pilgrimage, the big pilgrimage site in the world is Mecca. Islamic people go to Mecca by the millions. So much of what's written about pilgrimage is, we are told, about Mecca, and that's the great pilgrimage center of the world. But just as many people go to the 4 Buddhist mountains as go to Mecca every year. That's how important the Buddhist mountains are in China. They are a major pilgrimage pattern for the world. And unless we understand the pilgrimage patterns to these Buddhist mountains, I don't think we can understand pilgrimage. People who try to understand pilgrimage from the point of view of the numbers of people have to look at these mountains. But more importantly, these mountains have been there with written records for hundreds of years. These are pilgrimage sites with a history. They have a record. They are cultural features that's unlike many pilgrimage sites in the world. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to explore them, because I believe that it's extremely important for us who feel that we are studying Chinese culture, we are studying Buddhism in China, we are trying to understand the patterns of the way in which people live. Well, some of the mountains of China that are not Buddhist, but just there are many sacred mountains. There are Taoist mountains. There are basic Chinese cultural mountains. We have many, many lists. Every mountain has, or many of the mountains attract attention because of their physical state. So to go to Mount Hua, of course, part of it is, number one, that it's so unusual, it is so beautiful, and that you feel when you get there that you can see the whole world. That one of the things which you want is to go to a place where you can have a 360-degree view. And there are not many places unless you go to the top of the mountain. You can do it at sea, but you can do it better from the top of a mountain. So consequently, people were going up, they were going for the view. You know, in Chinese Buddhism, we always talk about the meditation in Chan of meditating on a wall. And people have interpreted that to say you put a wall in front of you and you sit there and look at the wall so that you really have nothing to distract you. But in fact, it probably in the text originally didn't mean that at all. To meditate from the wall meant to stand on top of a wall and meditate on a view and the whole world stretched out in front of you. To understand the nature of the world in which we live, you should meditate on a wall, which meant on top of the wall. And so on top of the wall reaches its apex by saying on top of a mountain. Because on top of the mountain, you see this vast expanse spreading out before you. And how often do you find in Buddhist texts the idea that you are being able to look and see a vast expanse? You can see in all directions. You can see in the 10 directions. You can see many cosmoses. You can see millions of Buddhas. All of these are expansive views, and the way to have the physical experience of that is to go to these mountain places. It is also important, I think, when you do pilgrimage, that it be difficult. An easy pilgrimage doesn't really work. We were talking at dinner tonight about, in Japan, the 33 pilgrimage patterns of Shikoku Island. There are 33, and you should go to all 33 places. And so people go with their book. So you walk, you go to the monastery, and they stamp your book, and you get all 33. People started to drive. Instead of walking the 33, you can now drive it. But everybody says, that's not a pilgrimage. That doesn't work. That's cheating. You need to get out there and put one foot in front of the other. You need to walk it. So when you look at like Wutai Shan, part of it is how hard it is to get there. And the harder it is to get there, the more it shows how intense you are on your activity. It shows that you really are willing to do this. You have committed yourself to a particular task and you perform it no matter how hard it is. If you try to override that, you miss it. Years ago, I took some students on a hiking research in the Himalayas, and we walked. You walk from the foothills, and you walk 100 miles, and you walk 200 miles, and you walk to the mountains, and because you walk, you acclimate yourself. So by the time you get to really high mountains, your body is pretty much prepared for it. But then came helicopters, and they started flying tourists in to very high altitudes from the Kathmandu airport, and they start dying. You can't do that. You can't suddenly raise your altitude level from 4,000 to 15,000 and get out and start walking around. You have high altitude sickness. In other words, I think that's what the Buddhists have always felt. You can't shortchange it. If you do, you wreck it. If you drive Shikoku, you're never going to have the experience of a pilgrimage. You must do this difficult thing. And the more difficult it is, then the more satisfaction you have at the end of it. You feel, I really did something. I'm really proud of myself. I managed to get all the way to the top of this peak. I walked it. So it shows you sincerity. Mountains are also, you want something mysterious often. And a mysterious place in a mountain will attract attention just by the nature of its physical presence. This great hole in the mountain in China, it attracts just because of its physical state. Whether or not anybody tells you anything about spirituality or spirits or what's happened there, just physically seeing it, you're taken aback. You are impressed by its physical presence. So that's why in pilgrimage, sometimes it's physical. You go there because it's physically so special that you feel there's power in this place because of its physical aspects. Sometimes you'll find in the literature a word which is very strange to all of us in English, marsh mounts. It is an English word. When you have the 5 great mountains of China, they outline a kind of directional. One is north, one is east, one is south, one is west, and one is central. They are measurements. They are boundaries of a type. And so the word marsh mounts has been used for them. These are mountains that are identified as being, in a sense, a kind of boundary and having to do with directions. And you want to have north, south, east, and west. You want to have the center. Those are all ways of organizing things and organizing the world. So the question is whether the 4 Buddhist mountains could be called marsh mounts. Because there's no real boundary that you can draw by putting a line between each of those mountains. You don't see a clear differentiation of the area in the polygon that you could create from those mountains. So while the famous mountains of China could be called this, I've not yet decided whether I think we could call Buddhist mountains this. The first great mountain, of course, was Wutai Shan. It's a strange choice to say that this was the first of the Buddhist mountains, but it was, in the sense of the 4. This is the one that was identified quite early, and some people would say that the identification of it quite early was a misinterpretation. But nevertheless, the Buddhists went to that area and they decided that there were 5 mountains, peaks in the area which created a region. And those 5 areas became for them sacred. And so Wutai Shan, in one sense, they always write about it. They said, Wutai Shan is very remote. Today it's not so remote because there are freeways and airports and people can get there pretty easily. But in the past it was remote. It was quite difficult to get there. There were few roads. And so when the Empress Wu was trying to make a decision, and somebody must have mentioned to her, in the past, our great emperors would make pilgrimage to mountains, and the mountains were like ministers to them. The mountains would express to the emperor exactly what they should do and how they should rule. So, there's this famous Buddhist mountain now, Wutai. Maybe you should go there. And she is, from a record, said, well, it's a long way. It's very remote. I'll tell you what, you make a jade image of me, and I will send that to Wutai Shan, and that will be my pilgrimage to Wutai Shan, will be my image goes there and is placed on the mountain. So she herself did not go. But by the Qing dynasty, the emperors were going there. They were using it, physically going there in order to have the mountain speak to them. Because by that time, the mountain had become so imbued with the idea of wisdom that it was a place which an emperor wanted to say, I'm going there. In fact, when one of the Qing emperors went there, he suggested that maybe he was a reincarnation of Manjushri and that he was returning to his mountain. So you could use it for governance. The mountains would allow you to give yourself legitimization. You could legitimize your rule by saying, I went there, I was there, I'm part of the presence of that mountain. Wutai Shan, as we heard, became the place of Samantabhadra. Of all the mountains, Wutai Shan, I would say, probably is the most beautiful. Of the 4 Buddhist mountains, you could say that people had been going there long before the Buddhists came along because it was so unique and it was so beautiful. And that the Buddhists going to a place which was already being used for some form of pilgrimages, I'm sure, Wutai is a very unique and beautiful place. Also mysterious. Of all the mountains, it's the most mysterious. The fog comes in, and the fog creates these wonderful backdrops for some of the peaks and covers the valleys, and you don't know what's under it. There's a kind of mystery that pervades it. One person wrote, when I go to Wutai and I meditate, I can visualize Samantabhadra. That is the Bodhisattva who dwells there. I can visualize Samantabhadra. And then that vision fades and I see just the blue peaks again. And I have to go back into some form of visual meditation so that the Bodhisattva appears to me once again. And I don't just see peaks, and I don't just see mountain things, rocks sticking up. I see the Bodhisattva. Wutai Shan is the least visited of the 4 mountains. It's beautiful. And in the winter, it's spectacular, I would say. But of all of the mountains that you look at, this was the most difficult to inhabit with a bodhisattva. To try to get a bodhisattva who was in residence there turned out eventually, according to the lore, not to be something that was accomplished by Chinese. It was done by the Koreans. A Korean monk came who was a Sheela prince, it said. And the lore says that he came to that mountain. His name was Kim, surprise, surprise, from Korea. And Mr. Kim came to that mountain, and he became so much a teacher and so important to the place that people began to say, this is a bodhisattva. And he has come to this mountain, and now he is residing here. Now, if that's true, and if that, it's very hard to know with lore, but I think one should take lore quite seriously. I do not believe that we as scholars are always correct in our easy dismissal of local lore. We can just toss it aside very easily and say, oh, this is what people make up. Oh, this is just local, popular religion. We as scholars know better, and if kind of thing. But I see a real change happening in scholarship, particularly in anthropology and archaeology. Many of them are now saying, we have been too quick to throw away the local lore. And there's one anthropologist that I really like. He works in Eastern Africa, of all places. And he said after years of study, that he finally realized how important it was for him to take seriously what people told him. He said, it's very important for us as scholars to listen to people who talk about their experience and what they believe and how they react and relate to the place in which they live. And he said, scholars need to become vulnerable. I love that idea. We need to become vulnerable to that local lore, to feel that it's telling us something very important, and we may not know what it is. We may have to really think, what is this local lore saying to me? Why is it that people tell these stories and tell them for centuries and find them so satisfying? If we dismiss that or throw it away, then we may have thrown away the only basic information we will have about that place. So with Wutai Shan, the very idea that they would inhabit a bodhisattva on the basis of a Korean monk who came there and lived and practiced and taught, I don't think we should throw that away. There is something very important about that story. And it's interesting because you seldom hear about him in Korean literature. It's amazing to me because you would think that if you had one of your fellow people who went to China and was so praised that they, in fact, developed a mountain idea around him and made him the reincarnation of Dizang or Kshetigarbha. I think it's important for the Koreans to take a look at themselves and say, why don't we know about this person? He was from Shilla dynasty, that's a long time ago, but he was one of ours. And why was it that the Chinese thought he was so special that they would say his presence on the mountain has changed a major Chinese mountain? Wutai Shan, of course, is hardly a mountain. And you know, you have to be really careful in Chinese. The word Shan, immediately you think mountain. But in the Buddhist naming of monasteries, it doesn't really mean mountain. It's like Foguan Shan, of course, in Taiwan. It doesn't say that Foguan Shan is at a mountain, because it isn't. It had nothing to do with the mountain. But this was true throughout Chinese history, that Shan became used as a kind of metaphor for an important place, which was important because it had some of the aspects of a mountain. In other words, that's what I said about emperors saying, you've got to go to the mountain to learn. You can't have it without mountains. So name your place mountain. Metaphorically make it an important place. And so monasteries that carry that name are really doing that. And it's many places in China that you see the word Shan doesn't mean a mountain. It means a special place where something special is happening. So Wutai Shan, of course, is by the sea. There's no real mountain there. I would say that in the Mahayana Buddhism, the most famous mountain is called, literally translated, Vulture Peak. Gritakuta, Vulture Peak. And in the Prajnaparamita literature, as well as in the Mahayana text, but the Prajnaparamita in particular, it says the Buddha went to Vulture Peak, and there he taught the doctrine of emptiness. Well, I made a pilgrimage to Vulture Peak, or where they say it was. If you're expecting a mountain, you're in for a big disappointment. It's a hill. It's just a hill. You can walk up it in about 20 minutes. It's not even a huge hill. And it's got, and the idea of vulture, then people looked at it and they said, it must look like a vulture, otherwise why do they call it Vulture Peak? But when we look at the old records, we can now understand that peak, and this helps us to look at Chinese mountains as well. We look at Vulture Peak as actually having vultures on it, probably, because just below it was the charnel field where they tossed the dead bodies. And the vultures fed on those dead bodies. And it's like the Tibetans. They expose their bodies, sky burial. The vultures come and they eat the bodies. It's a wonderful way to dispose of the human body. It's quick. The vultures can take it, eat it. In Tibet, they can eat it in a day. And so I think of that peak, which people began to say, the mountains in China are like Vulture Peak. That is, it's a place where the Buddha taught. He made it famous by going there. And I think of him sitting on a peak which was, in one sense, rather eerie. If it was covered with the vultures that are eating the corpses of the dead, this is not a wonderful, cheerful place to go. But he, we are told, went to that particular peak and he taught about emptiness. And I thought, well, what better place to do it? There are all the dead bodies lying down there that are being devoured by the vultures. And if you want to know what's empty and what is impermanent, there's nothing that's going to show you the impermanence of life more than corpses that are being devoured by birds. And so he sits in that place and teaches. But that's how you imbue a mountain with special power. He gave it that power by the fact that he went there to teach. My mentor was Edward Konza, who translated, first one to translate the Prajnaparamita literature. He would never go to India. And I once said to him, I'll take you, let's go. You should see India. You've spent your whole life studying its literature. No, he said, never, never. The India I know is no longer there. I don't want to see the India that's there now. But he did say to me, if you go to Vulture Peak, bring me a rock from there. You're not supposed to do that because you're not supposed to go and pick up. But there used to be a monastery up there that was made out of brick, and the brick is still, little pieces are around. So I took him a little piece of brick from that mountain and gave it to him. And he kept it on his altar for the rest of his life. He couldn't go there. He didn't want to go there. But somehow he felt that there was power there, and that's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow night mostly. He wanted that, a little bit of that power in his hands. Wutai Shan is an almost unique situation in the world. It is a place where there is equal practice between Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism. They exist side by side and have for centuries. They don't fight with each other. They don't feel they're in competition. It's quite remarkable in that sense that you see, like, the white pagoda that's there. If you look at the top, it's all been all repaired, and it's completely Tibetanized, the way in which they cap that. You can see all the Tibetan people who come, the Mongols who come. They all come there. And people come also from Kathmandu, particularly the Nawari people of Kathmandu. They want to go to Wutai Shan. And when I first heard that, I thought, why would a Nawari, of all the places in China, that's their number one place to go. That's where they prefer to do their pilgrimage. Until I realized that in the story of Manjushri, Manjushri is said to have drained the lake that covered the Kathmandu Valley. That he drained the lake and made it inhabitable. And that where there was a lotus growing in that lake when he first saw it, that's where Svayambhu stupa is built. That stupa is there because it was the lotus which Manjushri saw and thought, I must drain this lake, and what the mud out of which this lotus is grown must become a place, a city. So therefore, the people in Kathmandu feel that to deal with their own location, they need to go to a mountain. They've got the highest mountains in the world, and you would think of all places where you don't have to go long to find a good mountain, that they instead would go to Wutai Shan as a major pilgrimage place. But again, it has to do with the way in which we interpret and the way in which we change things. So Manjushri becomes a really important person. There are so many stories about Manjushri. One story is that Manjushri was created, and that's the way the text reads, was created in order to spread Buddhism to China. That Shakyamuni recognized that in order to get Buddhism to China, you had to have a very special teacher. And that special teacher, say one of these texts, was Manjushri. So you can understand that when Manjushri is said to be in his presence, he's residing there, his presence is there. How do you know it? So when the pilgrims come to Wutai Shan, the question is, how do I know that Manjushri is here? And that's where people are taught to do meditation, visualization. They are taught to expect. And so they begin to have experiences of Manjushri when they're there. This tells us something else about the pilgrimage to the mountains. You can go to the mountains because they're physically beautiful. You can go to the mountains because they're unusual, they're powerful. You can go to the mountains because you think the mountain has special knowledge. You can do special things there. But in this case, we have the idea that you go to the mountain because it has a presence. And the question is, what does it mean by a presence? It has something residing there. There's something existing here. And so they felt that the presence of Manjushri there was established, and people began to have experiences where they say, yes, I went there, and I experienced Manjushri, and he came to me. I could see him. People had visions. They had visionary experiences. And every time a pilgrim would go there and have one of these experiences and go home and tell people, and they all came, I want to see him too. I want to be there. See, the Chinese were always felt they were at a disadvantage. the Buddha was long gone. Shakyamuni, by the time the Buddhism got to China, Shakyamuni Buddha had been gone for centuries. And so you have texts written where people are crying because they say, I live in a time when there's no Buddha. What should I do? There's no Buddha to teach me. So there developed the idea that you can have visualization and that the meditative practice of seeing a Buddha becomes very important. That you should be able to visualize and have the presence, sense the presence of that Buddha or Bodhisattva. So it's almost like a meditation for presence, to feel it, that you're really having it. I told you that the first reference we have that's usually quoted, which is in the Huayan Sutra, refers to Qingliang Shan, and it says it's in the northeast. And they identify that as being Wutai Shan. Most people would say the verdict is definitely not there to support that idea. Because they said it's based on this, that in that sutra it says that Manjushri lived in this mountain, and it was to the northeast of India. What's northeast of India? Wutai Shan. This is northeast of India. Therefore, it tells us that Manjushri is here. We have textual proof. We have sutras that tell us this is the case. And this is where I spoke a little bit ago about local lore. See, my textual scholarly thing is to say, oh, come on. It could be northeast of anything. And northeast doesn't mean in China. It can be northeast in India. It can be in the Himalayas. But we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss it. That's the vulnerability which is being called upon for scholars to listen to the local lore and say, okay, that's the lore. Let me deal with that. Let me take it as such. So that, of course, once they had inhabited Wutai Shan with the presence of Manjushri, it was a whole different story for that mountain. It was a whole different story, and it was an important spiritual story. It had enormous ramifications for Chinese history. I may not want to accept that reference in the Avatamsaka Sutra is this particular place on the surface of the earth. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because in the lore and in the practices and the way in which people used it, that's the important part. Manjushri was quite special. He, in sense, by the text, became more important than Shakyamuni. He was more important than a Buddha. Number one, he had taught the 7 Buddhas of the past. He was the teacher of all the 7 Buddhas that came before Shakyamuni. And Shakyamuni belonged in a lineage of people who had been the students of Manjushri. So that when you see Manjushri in his he always has the 7 former Buddhas of this world, either in his halo or in the paintings around him. He was obviously special. And he was more powerful than Shakyamuni because Ajatashatru was a king. He was an evil king. In one way, the most evil king in the Buddhist text, because he killed his father. Not only did he kill his father, he starved him to death. He was afraid to use a sword to kill him because he felt that the karma from that would be too much. So he simply put him in a cell and didn't feed him and starved him to death. So when the Buddha met with Ajatasattu, he couldn't help him. He said he's got to be reborn. He's got to go through a lot. But Manjushri did it. We're told in the text that Manjushri did away with all the bad karma that Ajatasattu had, that he was more powerful than Shakyamuni. So that the power and the presence of Manjushri was no small matter. And Manjushri, as a kid, he was, in the text, he was just a really young kid, was sent to talk to the famous Vimalakirti. Vimalakirti had faked illness, and the Buddha said to all his disciples, one after another, go over there and see how poor old Vimalakirti is doing. Of all the people who went, Manjushri was the one who said to the Buddha, you know, I'm very young. I don't know anything. Why are you sending me? I won't be able to defend myself from Vimalakirti. He's going to just cut me to the ground because he knows so much. But yet he went. And of all the people who went to talk to Vimalakirti, in one sense he was the least arrogant. He was more aware of what Vimalakirti had to teach, and he learned a lot from Vimalakirti. Well, okay, I can't reverse it, doesn't matter. We have a very famous story in the Gandavyuha. A young person, Sudana, pardon, that's all right, I'll just keep going. A young person went to Maitreya and said, I want enlightenment. And Maitreya sends him out on a journey. He said, first of all, you need to go to this Bodhisattva named Manjushri. You need to go talk to Manjushri. And Manjushri says, you need to visit a bunch of teachers. Don't just go to one. There's nothing more limiting than only having one teacher. You must go to many. Young man, you take off and you wander the world. And he went out on his journey from Manjushri, who had sent him. I love the story when Sudana finally met the next Bodhisattva, Samantabhadra, the one who inhabits Ame. In this part, the Bodhisattva is a woman. Samantabhadra, in the story that's put into the panels at Borobudur, is a woman. The gender has been shifted. And when Sudana comes to her and wants enlightenment, all she does is just to reach out and touch his head. And he has insight. Samantabhadra is tied to Manjushri in those stories. Sudana starts with Manjushri, but Samantabhadra is where he ends up. And she's extremely powerful in terms of helping him with his journey. That's where he finally achieves his major understanding. So if you go to Borobudur, all of the panels that tell this story of all the 52 teachers, you can follow the journey. You can walk around, it's almost a mile of these panels as you walk it. And it tells the story of Sudana and all of his teachers ending up with his last teacher, who touches his head. On the Borobudur's images, they have it. So he's touching his head, and that just is like a spark. It's like electricity hits him. So Manjushri and Samantabhadra are often put together. And so Japan built 2 nuclear power plants side by side. And they said, how can we name them? And somebody said, well, you know, in Buddhism, the 2 people who were always said to be close to each other, Manjushri and Samantabhadra. So they said, okay, and they named these 2, Manjushri and Samantabhadra. Well, a lot of people were upset. They said, this is sacrilege to take these great saints of the Buddhist Mountains and make them the names for your nuclear reactors. So when these were damaged by the great tsunami in recent times, everybody said, see, you never should have named them that. Samantabhadra rides on an elephant. Manjushri rides on a lion. And the question is, what does the elephant mean that Samantabhadra is riding on it? And the answer is that the elephant represents the application of wisdom. In other words, you can have wisdom from Manjushri, but if you really want to make use of it, how do you make use of it in the ordinary world? And so the tamed elephant that worked and dealt with all the things that you do in general life, that's what Samantabhadra decided to ride on, was this tamed working elephant to say, you eventually have to go back into life. You have to go back into ordinary activities. You got to live this thing in everything that you do. And so that's what is represented when it shows her riding on an elephant. At the famous Longman Caves, you can see Vairochana Buddha and Manjushri and Samantabhadra stand on both sides of Vairochana. They are tied together so that the fact that one of them occupies one of the mountains and the other occupies another is an indication to some degree why Samantabhadra is a bodhisattva chosen to be one of the resident bodhisattvas. It is these stories of these 2 together. Samantabhadra is mysterious. Samantabhadra had the experience of being able to visualize until it said that he, she, depending on which gender she was at the time, the bodhisattva saw that the Buddha is in every atom. Every atom has the Buddha. And that Samantabhadra was the one that was saying, the Buddha is everywhere. The Buddha is in everything. The Buddha is in the whole of the cosmos. There are billions and billions and billions of these Buddhas. And that kind of visualization was major for people who went to Ome to practice. Then we come to Avalokiteshvara and Guanyin. This is a big problem for Buddhist scholars. Avalokiteshvara is always male. Guanyin is always female. They are said to be the manifestations of the same bodhisattva. So when did the gender change? I have my own new theory that I'm working with. I don't know if you'll agree with it. You don't have to, but I think we make a mistake if we think that we're going to find the answer to the gender shift in the early Buddhist sutras. I don't think you'll find it there. Avalokiteshvara is dominant, but he is male. Avalokiteshvara, excuse me, sorry, he rides he rides on a lotus. Oh dear. He rides on a lotus, saddle, on a lion. He always shows one foot. He is, oh, thank you. Appreciate that. But he's male. I believe we can only understand the change if we look at it from the point of view of the ocean. This is why my current project is to create an atlas of maritime Buddhism. That as Buddhism came through the seaports from India to China, when they came by sea, the Avalokiteshvara is present in all the seaports. In Sri Lanka, every river mouth has a picture of Avalokiteshvara carved in rocks. It's a Theravada country. But their history was that Avalokiteshvara was the god of the sea. All sailors depended on Avalokiteshvara to protect them. Recently, they uncovered this wonderful inscription on a little hill. The hill is above an area where they had copper mining. And at that copper mine, the ships would come and load up the ore and go away. But on this hill, which looks down over the harbor, copper is all used up, long gone, nothing there now, just trees, but this inscription. And it says, Avalokiteshvara looked down from the hill and saw the sailors, and he sent forth his power to protect them from storms and troubles. He was the person to protect the sailors as they sailed. But when it got to China, then Avalokiteshvara, who is depicted always as a male, how do you know that? It's the way they hold their legs. This is a masculine setting. Men lift their legs and have the freedom to do that. Women nowadays do because we've gotten away from this. But in the old days, this kind of posture is always male. So Avalokiteshvara is beautiful and sometimes almost feminine in appearance, has a male stance. It is not a female stance. I think some of the most beautiful images I've ever seen are the Avalokiteshvara images from Sri Lanka. This gold one that they recently discovered. It is just the most magnificent thing. If you go to Colombo, you must go to the museum and see this. It's beautiful. But out in the countryside, the lore tells us something else. Out in the countryside, you find the image that says that here is Avalokiteshvara, the white image. And this, by the way, once they destroyed the Buddha at Bamiyan, this became the world's tallest Buddha image. So Avalokiteshvara is shown here with Tara and Sudana, the young man who took the journey. The local lore says that Avalokiteshvara was married to Tara, she was his wife, and Sudana was their child. It's a family scene according to the local lore. And once again, I've tried to say we need to look at that quite seriously. We don't need to just dismiss it out of hand and say that's some fanciful thing which the locals have put on it. But that this bodhisattva was playing a role in terms of familial aspects. But when Guanyin gets to Guangzhou and to South China, then the gender shift occurs. Because in that area, the goddess of the sea, it's a goddess who protects the sailors. They say, oh yeah, we have a goddess that protects the sailors. Well, that's obviously Avalokiteshvara manifests himself as a female goddess to protect the sailors. I truly believe that that's when the major shift occurred, and Guanyin in South China became female and has remained so to the present day. Now, bodhisattvas could produce and show themselves in whatever form they wanted. Sometimes it's male, sometimes it's female. They will show themselves in whatever form people need to see. So therefore, sometimes they show themselves in not too wonderful a form because they say, this person needs me to be like this. So that's what we see, that Guanyin begins as associated with the sea and all the great beautiful images that we find of her on the seacoast, Hainan Island, even up the coast of China, in Korea. She's always put next to the sea because she is the one who protects the sailors. And in Okinawa, they have taken one of her images and placed her at the reef where she protects the sailors from running into the reef and having wrecks. She's a protector of sailors. And then finally, Kshitigarbha. Kshitigarbha is also an interesting one. Kshitigarbha, or Ditsang, is said to be the bodhisattva who will protect us during the time between Shakyamuni and Maitreya. After Shakyamuni entered nirvana, he's gone. Really gone. There's no contact. There's no way to have contact. He left behind his teachings. We can use his teachings, but he's gone. So this bodhisattva comes forward, and this bodhisattva vows, I won't go to nirvana until Maitreya Buddha comes. I'm going to stay around and help people during this interim period where there's no Buddha. So that alone makes Kshitigarbha a very important person. But the interesting thing for us is that Kshitigarbha, when he becomes placed on Wutai Mountain, as I mentioned before, he is shown as the only bodhisattva who's ever depicted as a monk. There's no other bodhisattva ever depicted as a monk. He's shaven-headed, he wears a monk's robes, and he is, it was said from their perspective, this monk came from Korea. He was the personification of Kshitigarbha. He came as a monk, and he came to this mountain and taught. And that's how Kshitigarbha came to be placed on Wutai Shan. So we can see that Kshitigarbha has many roles to play. Perhaps the most important one is in Japan. If you go to, you see many places where there are little Buddha images and they have baby gear on. if there is an abortion, the aborted fetus is called a water baby in Japan. It has no body. Without a body, you cannot be reborn. So, people who have had abortions, particularly many women after World War II, it was a major form of birth control. It was all put on the woman to have the birth control. Men took no responsibility. I have to criticize my own gender for this. So some had multiple abortions. But always there was, for many of them, this feeling that that fetus has no body. So it cannot be reborn. So Shikigarba, Jizo in Japanese, Jizo said, I will give my body to that child. I can manifest as many bodies as are needed. So if you put an image of me and pray to me, that image will show that I have given my body to the aborted fetus, and it can now be reborn and continue its journey, its life's journey. So in Japan, hundreds of thousands of women have used this, and that's the main place where you have some kind of cult activity associated with it, except in China at Wutai Shan. Now, last thing. In the West, in the Mediterranean, there was a man named Emeritus, and he was sent on a journey down to what's now Yemen. And when he was there, he said, I saw a pillar, and carved in that pillar was the information that Zeus, our main god, had once been a human. And he came back and began to teach his doctrine. He said, all of our gods, once upon a time, were humans. And because of who they were or because of what they did, they are now born up in the heavens as a god. Where he found this was the little seaport of Aden in Yemen. This was a place that was in contact with India. One cannot help but think that part of what he was bringing back with his Humanistic doctrine of the spiritual people were once humans came from the Buddhist concept of karma and rebirth. That you can be a human and be reborn as a spiritual deva was so much a part of Indian lore that it would make sense that somehow this is part of that idea filtering its way through to Europe. And this seaport that he went to was the place where all the ships came from India and unloaded and transferred their cargo to other ships that would take it up the Red Sea or across to the Nile River. The Buddhist idea of bodhisattvas, where did they come from? Who are they? How did they even come to exist in all of these places? In one sense, the bodhisattvas become the incorporation of all of the information, like Manjushri. He becomes the sort of representative for wisdom. And Samantabhadra becomes the whole thing for practice in life. And Guanyin becomes complete and utter compassion for everybody, for everything. And Kshitigarbha becomes the protector, the help with people who are dead, the help with human bodies if needed. All of these aspects of life came to be placed on certain personages. And so when we read about these bodhisattvas, they are expressing all of these human issues, all of these human concerns. So when I look at the mountains of China with their 4 bodhisattvas, and I think about people visualizing them and saying, sometimes you just see the blue spires, and sometimes you see the bodhisattva, is that Chinese Buddhism used these mountains for their pilgrimages. And the pilgrims came for all kinds of reasons. But they came, and those mountains became covered with Buddhist monasteries. They were places where people came to meditate. They are still that. Thousands of people go every year to these 4 mountains. They practice. They are taught to visualize even. They are there to have the feeling of the presence of a bodhisattva. And there's nothing quite like it anywhere else in the world. The system of these 4 mountains and their bodhisattvas and the power which is present in each of these places, which is available to the pilgrim, is not just ordinary tourism. There are tourists. We're all tourists in one way in the world today. We all take plane trips. We all go to foreign places. But for the people who went to these mountains, their expectation was not just for a trip. And that is still true when they interview people who are going there. That they come with expectations. They come with some little knowledge of this place. Maybe not much, but some. And so I think that if we want to understand what pilgrimage means, if we want to understand about bodhisattvas, if we want to know what the Mahayana Buddhist tradition is all about, there's no better place to start than these 4 sacred mountains. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lancaster, for your enlightening and inspiring presentation. Now we have come to our Q&A session, so if anyone has any questions, this is a great opportunity to ask.
Yes. Please.
Yeah, do you have any questions? That's Professor Lancaster. We still have 30 minutes. It's a good opportunity for all of us to ask Professor Lancaster.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm pretty sure there are more questions cooking. Okay. I have a question about, you mentioned about this religious experience. You start with this historicalize those 4 sites, why they become a sacred site. And the mountain from a physical mountain become a metaphor, and so on. But then when it comes to a religious side, not just spectacular nature, you focus on religious experience. And then what I heard, if I remember, is particularly about this visualization. And I'm asking more information. So I was wondering if for the practitioner, this kind of visualization also need education. Or if I just go to the mountain, I get wow. I don't know. It's maybe then it's a different spectacular experience. So can you provide more information about this visualization, this particular
Well, I don't mean to glorify that everybody who goes gets it, has the experience. You understand that. However, as I've watched these places through the years, it's come to me that they have become more and more places of education, more and more places of meditation practice, that they have ceased to be just purely tourist sites. The first time I went to Wutai Shan was just after they first opened it again in the 70s. I went there. It was still a place where the coal miners came to have their vacation. They had taken over the whole place and they turned it into dormitories so that these coal miners could come there and have a mountain vacation and get some fresh air. And so the buses would come with all of the workers and they lived there. But when I was there, I noticed, as did some of the tourists, they were quite surprised to find that the government was beginning to restore the Buddhist elements in the buildings. They had craftsmen making the images that had been destroyed in the Cultural Revolution. They had brought in both Tibetan and Chinese artisans to reconstruct for the altars and for the other aspects. And you could see people walking by, seeing these people making an image which during the Cultural Revolution would have been absolutely forbidden and destroyed. Here they are carefully making them. And they were surprised, and so was I have to say. But since then, I've just watched Wutai Shan grow into a completely different place, but in a sense, back to its old original purposes. It is the great place of Manjushri. The Tibetans come in large numbers. The Mongolians come in large numbers. The Chinese come. The Nepalese. People come from all over because of Manjushri. They come knowing about Manjushri, but they also come to, and there are places now where they come to do practice right on the mountain and live there for a while. So that I think this is happening in those areas. And you can see that more and more people say, I'm not content with just a tour. I'm not content with a tour guide who tells me a few jokes and keeps me happy and takes care of where I'm going to stay the night and gives me food. They really, truly are coming to say, what is this place? What can I get from this place? I think there is a new kind of modern pilgrimage, if you will, going on. And I haven't really studied it. That's your field, and I hope sometime you can do that. Tell us what you see in terms of these modern pilgrims. And as I said, people come with all kinds of reasons, all kinds of expectations. From the interviews, we can certainly see that expectations determine the experience of the person. What you expect to happen will very much depend on what you actually experience. So the preparation for coming is important. It doesn't all happen there. But once you're prepared for it in any way, then here's your chance. You're in the presence of Manjushri or Samantabhadra. You're where their presence is felt, so how do you take advantage of it? I think people want to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I can add some opinion for you.
Sure.
About the education. I think that especially for the lay persons, as they should be educated for Buddha teaching, I think it's important.
About the visualization, the spectacular image or present, that kind of experience.
Yes,
all
okay.
experience.
I think when before to prepare the pilgrimage to the second mountain, I think except the monks, I think if for lay person, they should know some more depth about the Buddha teachings. I think this is more important. When they reach there, they know, oh, what's this, what's that, and they can get some mysterious experience. They can experience some mysterious, I think. So when the practitioner want to practice before practice, they should learn some Buddha teaching, I think. So study in MA program is very important.
Surprise, surprise.
Oh, yes.
Good evening, Professor.
Good
So
evening,
actually,
good to see you.
I find the question about the gender of Guan Yin very interesting. So is there any influence from the worship of Maju in the southern China? Because it's very common that southern China like Zhejiang, Fujian, and Taiwan. So we worship in Hong Kong actually Tinhao. So we worship the Tinhao or the Maju. So is there any influence of that, and then it affect the image of Guan Yin?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I quite get the question, I'm sorry, but I can say this, that there are regional differences in practice in China. There always has been in Buddhism. And one of the great problems that we have is that we study Chinese Buddhism historically from the perspective of what happened up at the old Chang'an and the north. We're dominated by that because that's where the capital was of the Han Dynasty. That's always been the capital is Beijing. It's still northern dominated in many ways. But the present practice of Buddhism in China and in Taiwan is not northern. It is the practice of Buddhism that developed in the south. It is the Guanyin practice, which came from the south, came through, I think, the seaport, Guangzhou, up to Putao. It's more southern. It was the tantric tradition came directly from Sri Lanka through Palembang and Sumatra to southern China. The mind-only school, the late texts were brought directly into South China. The order of nuns, the first nuns were ordained by Sri Lankan nuns who were transported by boat from Sri Lanka to Guangzhou. If we want to understand Chinese Buddhism regionally, then the form which we see today is southern and not northern, in fact. When you look at the mountains, though, then in many ways the mountains are northern. They are northern. And consequently, they rely very strongly on the old textual traditions and the commentaries to those traditions, more than you would find in the South. So I haven't really been able to do much with this, but your question, I have to say, is a good one, because I believe that we ought to really look at the regional differences in China to begin to understand the mountains better. But if I had to stake my life on it, I don't know what I would say, but I would probably say the mountains are more northern than southern.
Professor Lancaster, thanks for the lecture. So I have a question related to the what you said at the beginning of the lecture about meditation from the wall, and I found it's very interesting. You said people meditate facing on the wall because it's on the top of the wall. Actually, that was the true meaning of meditation. So my question was a little bit related to the Japanese Zen. For example, the Caodongzong or Soto Shu in Japan, I think is that more focus on this aspect, because when I saw a movie or when I saw a video, and also recently I saw the film called Zen, talking about the founder of Japanese Shu study Humanistic in Yuanzi, etc. So they focus a lot on meditation from the wall, compared with two other maybe schools in Japan, Wutai Shan or Bangshu.
Yeah.
So
of course.
Was that the original way of meditation, if I put this way, to face in front of the wall, or could you just elaborate more?
Oh, in practice, you're quite right. The practice has been to face the wall. But when you go back to the oldest text and actually read it from the perspective of syntax and grammar, that isn't what it says. It says you meditate on the wall. And there are traditions in which, in Buddhism, people try their best to be at a place where they meditate and look out. This is especially true for the mountains. People who go to meditate on the mountains do so partly because you have this vast vista. And that vast vista is really important for your understanding of the world. You need to see the world. Well, you can't necessarily see the world looking at the wall. But if you sit on the wall and you look out, and that's why the mountain becomes sort of, the wall is like a metaphor for the mountain. By sitting on the mountain and getting the full vista of the world, then you're getting insight, wisdom, information. So I think the mountain meditation is maybe misunderstood as being totally different from wall gazing. And it is. But maybe the wall gazing is just a later interpretation, and that from earliest days they had the idea that the best place to meditate is where you have as wide a view as you possibly can have. Just a thought.
We have a metaphor from the Sun Temple.
Yes.
Its word 就是那个达摩祖师念刚才这个说的 this story is from the Sun Temple.
Yes.
This comes from Sun. Can you explain about meditation?
Put him on the spot.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Lancaster, for your inspiring lecture. So for my grandma's generation, she visited 4 mountains for pilgrimage, and I actually went to Malaysia with her. And she always told me that she had this special and mysterious experience, and she's a Buddhist, and she hugely impacted me. And nowadays, I have so many really pious Buddhist friends, and they are saying, however, in the new, informational era, that less and less pious Buddhists visit these 4 mountains, and rather they would say that only tourists would visit this for, economic or other purposes. So to what extent do you think the function of these 4 mountains offering, say, the mysterious, the beautiful, the phenomenal views, those functions are declining, and we might have, future new functions because of the influence of tourism's rising and globalization's
influence. So.
Well, it's certainly the case that we have the ability for people to travel much more easily than they ever did before. It's not only we have good roads, railroads, airplanes. So travel is not a big issue anymore. You can do it. On the other hand, I feel that the people who go to these places, in many cases, are in fact going there with an expectation of having a religious experience, more than people will give them credit for. And that's why I appreciate the fact that one sociologist has begun to interview the tourists. It's one thing to be just observing them and say, oh, I saw these crowds of tourists and they're just tourists. And so I'm reading their minds. I know what they think because I see them. There they are. They're just laughing and talking and walking around. But to actually interview them and to begin to say, what are your expectations? What did you come here for? What have been your experiences? Until we have more of that data, then I think this kind of easy dismissal of this as being mere tourism, as if that's a bad thing, I think we need to be careful about that.
I guess that's fine.
Yes?
For this answer. That's okay? Okay. Another question.
Thank you, Professor Lancaster. Actually, I have a question from a layman's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of us, we just don't have the luxury of visiting these four famous mountains, and most of us might be busy with our study or work. So my question is, how can we connect with Buddha in the mountain life? In his kind of environment. Thank you.
Well, I think that the connection that one makes depends on your situation and where you are, and it's possible to have wonderful experiences anywhere, anytime. It's not to say that this can only be happening in the mountains. I hope you didn't get that from my lecture. I didn't mean to say that. What I tried to say is that I would like to look carefully at these mountains and to ask the question of what is the experience that people have when they go there? How can I determine that? And I have to admit that I don't have a lot of the data which I wish I had. And some of what I say I probably shouldn't say because the data is too limited. But recently somebody has come up to me because we're planning to have a 3D virtual reality installation here in Hong Kong, maybe late 2019, on the Atlas of Maritime Buddhism at the Maritime Museum. And we've shown some of the pictures that we've been filming. And one nun said to me, we should produce a whole series of 3D virtual reality pilgrimages because we can't go to all these places. But if you could present it in such a way that I can walk into a room with the glasses and I can be there and I can see the vista and I can walk up and see the images and everything that's there, then maybe that's one solution to the problem of how I get there. I can't get there, but maybe someday monasteries or temples will say, we've got a 3D experience for you. You can come in this week. We're taking a 3D virtual reality tour to Wutai Shan. Would you go? No, you wouldn't go. Okay. Some would, some wouldn't. But you can have good experiences anywhere.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work. I'm not a Buddhist.
right? But I think that it's all kind of psychology.
Mhm.
We spend so much money over there, and then we just go so much hassle and over there, and then already just self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That's what it's
I've had I think that the virtual reality has a lot of advantages, and we don't use it quite right. If we use it in a good way, I'm convinced that you cannot teach art history without virtual reality. You don't see in a flat picture. You don't see enough detail. Students who work from pictures and books miss so much. If you show them the same picture where you can go up and see the cracks in the image if you want to, you can see the detail of the paint on it, of things like that, it changes their way of study completely. So from that perspective, I found virtual reality to be extremely promising. The other is, can the experience itself move you enough to say, I feel the same thing I would if I had been there in person? And that's another matter altogether. In that case, I'm sure there's a difference between the physical experience and just a light show. However, we may try it, may experiment with it a little bit. Always willing to do that. Thank you, though.
You can try. Join us. Okay.
Professor Lancaster, thank you for the inspiring lecture. I have a question about the other mountain, the other sacred mountain in Buddhism. I have the luck to go to Wutai Shan in China, and also the Wutai Shan near Osaka in Japan.
Yes.
To try, and I find that it's quite different between the sacred mountain in China and Japan. And I also know that you are very familiarized with the Buddhism in Asia, especially the Korean and the Japanese. I would like to know, is there, besides the of course, in different countries, different culture, and we have a different kind of mountain, sacred mountain. I would like to know that, is there any other mountains that is a Buddhist mountain, sacred mountain, also like the four sacred mountains you just mentioned, also have a Bodhisattva or any Buddhist image representation there?
Well, as I mentioned, in the local histories, we have 240 that are identified as having major Buddhist identifications. So, of course, there are many mountains that have this. The idea of constructing these four finally was completed by the early Ming. It took almost 1,000 years from the time Wutai Shan was first being mentioned and talked about until that announcement by the emperor in the Ming that there are these four mountains, and it was codified into these four are special. So that's just a process of history that they have been developed in this way, and it is a part of history. It wasn't something I invented. I'm just reporting on what happened. But of course, there are other mountains that for other individuals are just as important. And they go to them. There are Taoist mountains, for example, which the Taoists go to, that are just as important to them as these are to Buddhists. I'll speak a little bit more about this tomorrow, so I'll save some of my comments for that. I need something to say tomorrow, too. But thank you. Yeah, there's a difference. If you go to Korea, pilgrimage to these mountain sites in Korea is huge. The pilgrimages are enormous. And one of the things in Korea that I'll mention is that the Joseon dynasty turned against Buddhism in Korea fiercely. And they, would not allow a Buddhist monk or nun to enter a city. For almost 200 years, they could not go into a city. So when that happened, and you removed Buddhism from the city life, you just removed it. And they were all on the outside wall. You could have, if you wanted to go to a Buddhist person, you had to go outside the wall, and they had little places, little stands outside the walls. But yet Buddhism survived during all that time in Korea, and it survived because of pilgrimage. The ones that survived were the ones in the deep mountains, isolated, far from all this government persecution, and the support they got was from pilgrims who went there and brought donations of food and gifts and other things to them. So pilgrimage in that sense is, from the Korean perspective, is preservation of the tradition. And without pilgrimage, I think I don't know what Korean Buddhism would have been like today had it not been for that. That's why I don't want to discount people who go to these places. I don't want them to just be seen as tourists, because historically they have played important roles in terms of support. The monasteries in the mountains are supported mainly by two types, the government, the emperor officials, and the pilgrims. This is where they get their support. So without the pilgrims, many of them would not have survived. And I think that's probably true in China as well. A lot of these mountain areas totally dependent on those two sources.
One more question, the last one.
Professor, I want to ask a question. Because of the development of the tourism, we will pay more money for this pilgrim. And because of the leisure time of the people now is declined. So I want to ask, the separate utility comes from the consumption or really comes from the mountain itself?
If I understand what you're asking, the question is, and again, part of this I may answer tomorrow night a little bit more, but is it that the mountain itself has a lot of power, and that it is that local power which has generated the support that it has? Or is it that because people project onto the mountain an idea, and they build buildings on it, and they make study centers, and they attract people who live there, and there's a whole human development which is not the physical aspect of the mountain? Well, it's both. It is certainly the case that humans have affected very strongly how the four mountains developed. Without those monasteries, without those places for people to visit, to stay, without the monks and the nuns who are living on these mountains, then the pilgrimage patterns to them would be very different. You don't just pilgrimage to a bare peak. If you'll see almost every picture you show of a pilgrimage site, you'll see buildings, you'll see pathways, you'll see places for people to stay. So pilgrimage sites need development as well. And it's just the necessity of humans. We've got to have food, we have to have water, we have to have a place to rest, we have to have a place to sleep. And if at the same time you can have a place to listen, to learn, to practice religious activity for the good luck or filial piety or to help my poor sick child, so much the better. All of these are factors of pilgrimage. You can find all of that. You can find people who come for a whole range of meanings and reasons. It's just that we haven't taken inventory to see who's there. Why are they there? And that's something that I hope eventually we'll begin to think seriously about so we understand it even more without intruding on their experience or their privacy.
Okay. Professor Wong wants to comment her question again. So
sure, please.
Sorry, I just feel my question has been ended in the wrong notes, and actually doesn't mean that religious education is more important than religious experience. It's the other way around. And I thought that's what you try to argue. With that kind of visualization, this sort of experience, you physically feel the presence of the Bodhisattva, which is more important than daily chanting or learning and so on. And that's my comment on my own question. Yeah, and
Sure.
I need to ask if the method, for example, in order to get that kind of spectacular experience, do you need to demonstrate certain kind of hierarchy, the choice of transport, being vegetarian for 30 days, and so on and so on. So I'm asking for the empirical data. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
my notes.
I understand. And we all wish we had that data. Yes. Well, the early visualizations in the text, people were taught, sit in front of a Buddha image, just focus on it. Go from the feet and slowly move up until you come to the head. Then reverse, and keeping your focus, move your eyes all the way back down. And just keep that focus of that until you can close your eyes and visualize that image. And then when you meditate, have that visualization as the focus of your meditation. Not the physical image anymore, but you've now been able to imprint it so much that you can bring it to mind and you focus on the actual visualization rather than the image. That's a very old Buddhist practice, and you find it described in many texts. And in a sense, that's the basis for a lot of Tibetan meditation as well. It's visualization. I don't visualize things very well. My wife is a visualizer because she's an artist, and I'm amazed she can see what it's going to look like if we put a chair over there, and I can't. I have no ability to do that. So I look with wonder at the people who practice visualization. So for example, if you want a really authentic Tibetan thangka, it should be painted by somebody who has painted their visual image. Not that they were looking at the physical thangka at the time they paint. They're supposed to look at it and meditate on it until they close their eyes, and there it is. And that's what they paint. So there's a long practice of visualization in the Buddhist tradition. Pardon? Yes. Anyway, that's just more of that. Okay.
Thank you very much. An inspiring talk. We hear a lot of story of the 4 Mountains and the 4 famous Bodhisattvas. So, do you know how old is Professor Lancaster? 85 years, so at the age of 8. So it's okay. You're male, not female, it's okay. At the age of 85. So I think this is very, very, we should admire him at this age to still to promote the Buddhist teaching. So I think we have to show our respect to him. We still have another talk tomorrow night. The topic is the fixed and the portable sensitivity for Chinese Buddhist pilgrims. So I hope you can come again. Okay, see you tomorrow night. Thank you.
Thank you.